Good evening, class. We're going to review some of the concepts we learned in Chapter 9 before we get into Chapter 10 tonight. But in Chapter 10, we're going to deal a lot with money. Just, what is money, money creation, types of money, Federal Reserve, uh, probably more than you ever wanted to know about money. But that's the new material in Chapter 10. But again, we're going to go back and review just a couple of quick things that we did, at least I hope you took away from Chapter 9. And one of them is economic growth makes us healthier, wealthier, and happier, at least for the most part, at least for most individuals. They can say that economic growth, because of the stimulation of the economy and increased income levels, and just as society in general becomes wealthier, healthier, and happier, we assume that most rational consumers fall in line along those same kind of three guidelines that are being driven by economic growth. And short-term changes in real GDP versus long-term growth in production possibilities curve. We also talked a few minutes about that. The policymakers are not only policymakers but investors, talking heads on TV, really concerned about short-term changes in real GDP, because if you have enough of those short-term changes and they're going in the wrong direction, it's going to adversely affect, or it could adversely affect the long-term growth in any global economy. And then we spent just a couple of minutes talking about Rule 72, and that is a formula that economists have developed that basically can tell you the number of years it's going to take for an economy to double. So you take the number 72, divide it by the growth rate percentage, and you round it up to the nearest whole number. So, it may be, let's say it's, 72, and, the real growth rate percentage is, I don't know, what, 3%. That's going to get you to what, 24 years to double. So that's the way the formula works. And then they spent, I guess, a little more time talking about, trying to measure growth rate and its impact on society. And they try and the authors in the text gave you their viewpoint of how to, especially if you're trying to compare two economies or multiple economies. They suggested that you look at output per capita, and that's nothing more than the real GDP divided by the population. So you may have two economies that have the same GDP, but one of them has twice the population as the other. It's just automatically, again, going back to your math magic, anytime that you've got twice the population in the denominator on one, and you've got the same numerator, the one with the twice population is going to have a smaller ratio. So again, go back to, I guess you could say, go back to basic algebra when you're trying to do some of these calculations. And as I said the last chapter, don't make the math any more difficult than you have to. This text is not, I would consider both their micro text and their macro text from Flat World, they are not going to be driven by a lot of high-powered math. You're not going to be taking, partial differentiation and, having to worry about calculus, but you are going to have to do some basic algebra to get to some of the answers that you may have included on your test. And then to simplify it for those in the group or those in any audience that not particularly inclined toward math, they have a really simplistic formula. And it said the percent change in output per capita is equal to the percent change in real GDP minus the percent change in population. So if you want that left-hand side of that equation to be positive, you've got to make sure that the percent change in real GDP is going to be greater than the percent change in the population for any market economy that you're trying to either measure or trying to compare across either with another market economy or across multiple markets economies. And then we looked at the aggregate production function. We looked at growth in the long run, aggregate supply. And an economy producing and operating on its aggregate production function is producing its potential level of output. So you want any market economy to be producing at its aggregate production function, and if it is, then you know it's producing at its potential level of output. And then we spent I guess, a fair amount of time talking about diminishing marginal returns. And I use the example of working at Starbucks, how Starbucks has their coffee shops set up and how they have them staffed. Same thing if it's going to be the same concept with any firm or any profit maximizing entity. It's going to have at some point, you can continue to throw labor at an issue, but at some point there's going to be diminishing marginal returns. Again, Starbucks, McDonald's, go to your local doctor's office. It's all the same concept. Just look around when you go in and see how they have them staffed and think to yourself, well, if I were managing this, is there a way that I could staff things differently to increase the marginal product of labor of everybody in this particular business that I'm walking in? And again, most students, when I talk to them about this, they can relate to McDonald's especially, or any other fast food, but really everybody seems to be able to relate to Starbucks for whatever reason. The labor market's in equilibrium at the natural level of employment. And while it's in equilibrium at the natural level of employment, it's also in equilibrium at the natural rate of unemployment. So at equilibrium, natural rate of employment equals the natural level of employment equals the natural rate of unemployment. And productivity, it's the amount of output per worker. And most companies, most companies probably aren't looking at the marginal product of labor. Maybe a little bit too complicated for them to calculate, but I will guarantee that the majority of them are looking at the average product of labor. They're taking output, dividing it by the number of units of labor they have, and they want that to increase. They want it to be as efficient as possible, because as efficient as possible, if they can control costs, it's going to increase the profit of that individual firm or that individual profit maximizing entity. So you're going to have managers, and it doesn't matter, Starbucks, McDonald's, doctor's office, Discount Tire, whatever business you walk into, they are concerned about that average product of labor. And down toward the tail end of the chapter, they started talking about sources of economic growth. And you've got, talked about the honesty and the rule of law, competition and international trade, property rights, physical capital, human capital. And to me, property rights and human capital, those are two of the really significant, opportunities for economic growth. And then lastly, they talk about political stability. And to me, when you're talking about political stability, you're talking about at that point, multinational companies. You're talking about, global investors looking for somewhere to park their excess funds and to drive profit off those excess funds. So they are really going to be looking at what the political stability of any given country is at that point. And then, since that winds us up on chapter 9, we're going to jump into chapter 10 for a few minutes before we take our first break. And we're going to talk about the nature and creation of money. And the first thing the authors talk about is this: what is money? If I ask most of my students what is money, they say, well, I've got some coins in my pocket and my billfold or my purse. I may have some dollar bills. Some students anymore, they don't even have any money. They don't even carry money. They'll whip out their debit card, because to them, that's all that matters, because they use that debit card for every transaction in their life. So a lot of people don't even carry money anymore. But the authors define money as anything that serves as a medium of exchange. Makes sense. But then you ask, what's a medium of exchange? And the authors define that as anything that is widely accepted as a means of payment. And we'll get into that in a little more detail in a few minutes. But the authors at that point break it off and they start talking about the functions of money. And as I said, we jump into the medium of exchange. It's one of the first functions of money that they bring up in the text. And it's a certain propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. That's what defines a medium of exchange. All societies settle on something to be money. Adam Smith talked about, medium of exchange. He talked about companies being in business not for their well-being, or maybe not for society's well-being, but to generate profits. And in Adam Smith's day, where we're talking about, I don't know, 1770s or so, there was a lot of barter. There was a lot of truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another, because it's kind of the way the economy worked. I mean, Adam Smith's a Scottish economist, so that's the way the economy worked for him. And if you think about, early America, mediums of exchange among Native Americans, especially things like horses and furs and shells and minerals. And then, the Spanish conquerors came in, and especially in the Southwest, and they were looking for, gold and jewelry and minerals to ship back to Spain. And even on the East Coast, there was just a lot of barter going on, and each economy sets up a medium of exchange. They're what they determine as money, and that's what drives the economies. Barter, when goods are exchanged directly for other goods. And if I think about it, my great grandfather, I guess, or maybe great great grandfather, I kind of lose track, was a country doctor. A lot of his patients, and he was, as a country doctor, he was pretty much a jack of all trades. Saw patients in his office, did some routine surgeries, did a lot of home visits or house calls, and a lot of his patients didn't have maybe the money to pay, but they would give him meat, give him baked goods, give him vegetables out of the garden. It was kind of a barter economy, and that was what he accepted in lieu of his services. So the United States has really, I don't want to say improved, it has increased the number of individuals that have moved away from a barter economy and more toward a monetary driven economy. Economists, they have the rule of has what I want and wants what I have. It's a requirement for trade, the double coincidence of wants. Barter economy is inefficient. And why is a barter economy inefficient? Because as they outline into the text, barter economy, you've got to search for somebody. Let's say you're a baker and you're baking loaves of bread, and if you're in a barter economy, you've got to search for somebody that A, wants your bread, and B, has something you want in return, as opposed to having an economy set up on a monetary economy. So that's always been the issue with barter economy, the amount of time that individuals spend searching for another trading partner or bartering partner that has that A, wants their service or wants their goods that they're selling, and has a good or service that that they're willing to exchange and agree upon. And that's why economists talk about has what I want and wants what I have. Money solves the double coincidence of wants problem. You don't have as many search costs, and productivity goes up because now you can spend more time working. The baker can spend more time baking loaves of bread as opposed to baking a few loaves of bread and trying to find somebody that wants to barter for him. At that point, the only real cost is the opportunity cost. The second function of money that the authors talk about is a unit of account. Barter is inefficient. Values and information vary. So I'm a baker. I'm baking loaves of bread. I come to you, and then you're a dairy farmer, and you sell milk. And I have an idea of what the value of my loaf of bread is. You have an idea of what the value of your, quart of milk or gallon of milk is. But sometimes in a barter economy, it's really difficult, A, to find somebody, and B, to determine what the value of not only my goods, but the value of your good would be. And that's where money eliminates this. Money, you can put a value. My loaf of bread's worth $3. Your milk is worth, $5 a gallon. Or maybe it's worth, let's make it easy, $6 a gallon. So I'll trade you 2 loaves of bread for a gallon of milk. And if everybody's happy, then that's the way the barter economy works, and everybody goes away happy. Think how much, you can see how much easier it is if you just had a monetary change, a monetary exchange. So I'm a baker, I've got 2 loaves of bread. Dairy farmer has, and my loaves of bread are worth, let's say they're worth $3 a loaf, and his milk is worth, it's $6 a gallon. He may not want 2 loaves of bread, but he'll give me $3 for 1 loaf. Then I'll turn around and give him $6 for his gallon of milk. So I've essentially taken and exchanged a loaf of bread for a loaf of bread and $3 for that gallon of milk. So monetary exchange just makes life easier for both the buyer and the seller. And because money is your common denominator, everybody understands it. I think we get into it a little later in this chapter about exchange rates, and we'll talk about it then. But most economies, most global economies now have a monetary currency, let's call it, that is pegged to something, and that's what the exchange rate, and we'll get into that a little later. Money serving as a common denominator is called money's unit of account. So that's where they get the unit of account. And it functions or standardizes the value of different goods and services. So as money's unit of account, it's there to standardize the value so that everybody understands the value of goods and services that buyers and sellers are negotiating for. Consistent means of valuing goods and services. It tells you what buyers are willing to pay, and it tells you what sellers are willing to accept. And again, in any negotiation, and it's pretty straightforward. You've got a buyer and you've got a seller. You've got a seller that is going to, and go back to your old micro class again. So your seller is basically going to set a price floor. The seller has in mind, and we'll go back to the bread example. Bread example is like $2. That's my price floor. I'm not going to take anything less than $2 for that loaf of bread. And the dairy farmer, maybe his price ceiling, or the price he's not going to go above, he sets it at $3. He said, I'm just not going to pay more than $3. And through the negotiation process, they may end up at $2.50. Dairy farmer's happy because he didn't have to pay $3. Baker's happy because didn't have to accept $2, and everybody goes away happy. So that's what we talk about. Medium of exchange, unit of account that helps set the value for both the buyer and the seller, and not only sets a value, but it's extremely necessary and essential in the negotiation process. Value of money changes from one period to the next, but allows us to evaluate trade-offs between any 2 goods and services. And if you don't believe the value of money changes from one period to the next, just look at the inflation rate that we've been experiencing over the last year and a half, 2 years. I mean, completely out of control. Go to the grocery store, go to Starbucks, go to your local McDonald's. Look at what the value of money. Think about what you could have bought for a $10 bill in, let's say, 2020. What you could have bought in 2020, and then think about what you could have bought in 21 and 22, and now in 23. And that shows you that the value of money changes over time. And then the third kind of the function that the authors talk about is, it's a store of value, an item that holds value over time. It, value and purchasing power stored. Money, during a high inflation period, the value is going to erode. And I'm not sure how much it's going to store value, but you can buy items or buy assets or buy goods and services with the money that you have. And at that point, those assets, those goods and services might very well store value more so than the money that you have in your pocket. And the authors actually talk about other assets store value, but not as readily exchangeable for commodities. So now you're talking about the convenience exchange. If I had I had some money and I was afraid it was going to lose value, and I bought a Renoir. So I've got this painting, I've got it hanging on the wall, and yes, it's holding its value, but you know how difficult it's going to be to, and they'll talk about liquidity a little later too, but you know how difficult it's going to be to liquidate that and get it exchanged back into money. I've got to find somebody that's willing to, that A, is willing to buy it, and B, willing to pay the price that I feel like it's worth, or I feel like the value is. You think about storing it for wealth. Most people think about gold, silver, buying a house. A lot of people think, hey, I'm going to buy a house with my money, and even in inflationary times, it's going to hold its value. Maybe, maybe not. That's what everybody thought in 2007, 2008, when they talk about, they talk about the what they call it, the Great Recession, when the market just, the bottom fell out of housing market. So bottom fell out of housing markets in 1989, 1989, 1990. So housing markets go through these cyclicals, rises and falls, and the value of property. So it's going to really depend on where you live as far as how the value of your house holds its value as you go out over time. Also, it stores value, but money allows consumers to spread purchases. You can spread purchases over time. It's not like, I think in the text they talk about what would happen to you if you got your paycheck on the first day of the month and you had to run out and spend it all, because if you didn't spend it all, the goods and services that you wanted would disappear. So, having a medium of exchange, having something that stores value, allows you as a consumer to spread your purchases over time. It's also very that store value drives financial transaction, and it also is tied to the behavior of prices. Because people, when people loan you money, they are accepting, or you're accepting debt, and in return, you're taking money, they're accepting debt, they're accepting maybe some kind of collateral, but that money is going to be their quote future payment streams over time as you pay that money back. Stable prices, money holds its value. Rising prices, money loses value proportionally to the rise in prices. Falling prices, money gains value. It makes sense. Think about inflation, deflation, or if you've got a zero inflation over time, money's going to hold its value. During inflation, most consumers, especially investors, try to trade for assets that will retain their value. And with that, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the types of money and go from there. Talk to everybody in a few minutes.